Welcome back. Controlled fires are often used as a conservation tool. They can rejuvenate certain species of fynbos in that the ash contains minerals and nutrients for the vegetation to regenerate. Controlled fires are also used to decrease dry flammable material, which could lead to runaway veld fires. In light of this week's fire on Table Mountain, let's discuss the role of controlled fires and their benefits now on the Midday View with Dr. Donovan Kirkwood. He's the curator and manager of the Stellenbosch Botanical Gardens, joining us now via Zoom this hour. Welcome, Dr. Kirkwood, to the Midday View. Thanks for your time. I've seen there's been some comments and reports on social media and elsewhere about why it's important now and again to really get the fynbos burning. But the fire we're dealing with in Cape Town this week, I don't think it falls under the category of controlled fires.
No. It's actually quite interesting that although control fires are certainly desirable, this is an ecosystem that evolved to burn. Fire has been an integral part of these systems as long as they've been around. Control fires are actually still a minority of fires that burn in our landscape. The vast majority of fires that are still often ecologically beneficial actually are accidental or, as in this case, seems to be arson.
So when a fire like this one, for instance, has happened, let's say it is arson, police are still investigating, there's a suspect who's been arrested, he appeared in court briefly today. There's still the fire itself, the act of the blaze, there's a benefit for it, for the ecosystem.
It's unfortunately quite complicated. So there can be a benefit. So certainly fynbos, depending on how much rainfall the area gets, would need to be burnt in order to survive, in order for most of the plants that are present to be able to regenerate, would need to be burnt somewhere between sort of 10 and maybe as long as 20 years in some arid systems. But certainly fire is required. It's so difficult in a situation like this where there's so much damage and negative human impact around these fires. But certainly if there are areas of fynbos that were getting quite old, for those areas the fire would in fact potentially be beneficial.
Yeah,
we also don't want to see too much of a landscape burn in one go.
Yes.
And we certainly don't want to see bits of fynbos that are too young to burn, burning too frequently.
Is there a good time to burn the fynbos in terms of the month? I mean, I know Cape Town now heading into winter. Shortly we're in autumn and there's going to be rain. That's supposed to be the region's rainy season. Is it about this time that you could burn if you needed to burn?
Yes. Unfortunately, the perfect time to burn from an ecological perspective is exactly that time of year when it is most dangerous for humans and human infrastructure. So usually there will be a compromise between a fire that can be adequately managed and controlled and one that will be still hot and dry enough to effectively burn through the vegetation. We know that late summer fires, when the vegetation is very hot, very dry, is a great time to burn. It's just before the winter rains come. And what happens is that a lot of the plants, especially the proteas, release their seed post-fire. If they were to lie around through an entire summer, they would get predated by mice and rodents and so on, and there would be very little regeneration. Likewise, if you get a fire too far into winter, the vegetation is already much moister. There's water in the plants, but there's also potentially water on the plants, and the day temperature is lower. And you might not actually get an effective, thorough enough burn to be ecologically effective.
Okay.
So really it is this trade-off between something that is safe for human environments, but also is still hot and dry enough to be when the veld would have burnt naturally.
Yes. Have we seen some natural burning recently happening in parts of the Western Cape that we might have missed in the media that is not that dramatic?
You're asking the wrong person about specifics. I'm not currently a fire ecologist. more of a general science communicator.
But from your awareness, from the botanical awareness.
There certainly have been regular small control fires across the landscape. For example, the Overberg Conservation Trust, that does wonderful work in the very threatened Renosterveld of the Overberg, recently shared work that they were doing with private landowners doing ecological burns on their properties over the last month.
Yeah, I know there's been damage. I mean, I listened to the mayor of Cape Town yesterday, Dan Plato, speaking to the media in the morning with a firefighter, saying that it is the most devastating fire in a long time when it comes to historical sites. We know the buildings that were burned at the University of Cape Town, but in terms of the mass of land or the area that's been affected, it might not be as big as earlier ones, but still there's been a substantive impact on buildings, and especially on the heritage and historical site. But stepping back from that, from a botanical perspective, what would this fire, whoever started it, for whatever reason, we don't know. The case is in court. The police are investigating. Whether it's arson or not, we don't know yet. But whatever the cause of this particular fire on Table Mountain, would we see some benefit in terms of the ecosystem from your knowledge? I mean, you said earlier, we don't know if some fynbos was there that was still young. But it is a dry season. It is the end of the summer.
So again, it's very complex. In order to answer that question, one would need to look at a map of the felt ages that burned in the current fire. So essentially, if the vast majority of area that burned in this fire was more than, let's say, 10 years old, overall, one might see some kind of overall benefit. But if large parts of those areas were very young felt, and sometimes this happens on the edge of urban areas, because you've got much greater fire starting frequency in these places, you do get a lot of felt that is already too young to be burnt, that is burnt recently. And without reviewing the areas that burned in their fire history, I really can't precisely answer that question. Sorry to be such a scientist. But one thing also just to consider is that certainly the areas above UCT and going over towards Signal Hill were very still heavily planted up with old historic pines. There was a lot of alien vegetation on that interface with the human-built interface. And certainly where we're seeing very high fuel loads from invasive alien plants and from exotic trees, even if that felt was the right age to be burnt, that extreme fire intensity is certainly not going to be beneficial. It is going to harm that habitat and any chance of good restoration or good felt regeneration.
Okay, Dr. Kirkwood, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate some of the education there around the benefits of controlled fires in terms of biodiversity tool. And he says there have been a number of controlled fires happening currently. It's late summer. The Western Cape is preparing for winter rains. Of course, that's when it rains there. But this particular fire that we've seen is completely different. We'll never know whether or not it was beneficial properly to that ecosystem, you know. Never mind the cause, who did it, whatever, but we're just trying to look on the natural side of things.